Hello, Happy New Year, and welcome back to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and with me this week, as ever, in the studio, we have Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And joining us down the line from Luton, we have Spiked columnist Rakib Ehsan.
Hello, Happy New Year all.
Coming up on today's show, we'll be discussing Harvard's plagiarist president, the dangerous failures of the UK's asylum system, and the slipperiness of Sir Keir Starmer. So the embattled president of Harvard, Claudine Gay, finally resigned this week. People may have been following the story. She kind of came into the public eye around about a month ago with this disastrous congressional hearing on anti-Semitism on campuses. Now, she quite famously said she couldn't say whether calling for a genocide of the Jews was against Harvard rules. Now, since then, all these other allegations have been made against her. Some very serious allegations of plagiarism have come to the fore. And finally, she has admitted to have done it, and she has resigned. Now, Tom, on the surface, that might sound like a very dry sort of academic dispute, but this is far bigger than that, isn't it? This, speaks to something, a much bigger problem.
It certainly feels that way. I mean, it was international news for the best part of 24 hours at least. And I think that really speaks to the fact that this became a really key clash in the sort of transatlantic culture war. And I think in this particular instance, obviously, as you suggest, that particular congressional hearing and those ridiculous statements that she and other Ivy League presidents made set the hairs running on all of this. But the thing that eventually brought her down, the thing that made clear that Harvard could no longer stick by her, was these mounting allegations of plagiarism. I think it went up to 50 allegations at the end. It covered basically half of her published work in terms of journal articles. So it became very, very serious. And what you effectively had was a clash between what Ivy League universities would set as their kind of universal standards and essentially the dictates of DEI representation, standing by someone who was seen to represent all of those values. So it became a really key clash in that respect. And I think you can see how significant it was by the response to it. You had all of the usual suspects, Ibram X. Kendi, etc., essentially suggesting that this was a racist witch hunt.
Yeah.
Even though there, of course, have been plenty of academics who have suffered plagiarism scandals and had to fall on their sword. If anything, there's something quite racist about this assumption that you cannot hold, say, a black Harvard president to the same standards as any other academic. And since then, this bizarre attempt on the part of the media, who the American sort of liberal media, much more sympathetic to a figure like Gay, to effectively redefine plagiarism, to pretend that it's not really a thing. There was this,
no big deal.
No big deal. Oh, we all do a bit of it, don't we? I mean, there was that amazing headline on AP, which I'm going to read out in case I butcher it, but Harvard's president's resignation highlights a new conservative weapon against colleges, plagiarism. And that was a really good example, I think, of just how the woke left and their sort of outriders will basically ditch any principle they might have claimed to previously have stuck by purely to win a sort of pitched battle, as it were. The fact that I didn't is significant. And I also think that the fact that these attempts to turn this into a kind of racialized issue, the attempts to deflect any criticism of Gay despite the mounting evidence against her just on the basis of racial claimed victimhood, effectively. The fact that that didn't wash, the fact that that wasn't enough to save her, and the fact that everyone is kind of laughing these people out of town whenever they try to make those excuses now, I think suggests that whilst we don't want to overplay, a moving of the deck chairs at an Ivy League university, it feels like something has shifted this week, definitely.
Definitely. And Rakib, I mean, people have raised not just, people have been talking about how did Claudine Gay get this job in the first place? This is the most significant and most important academic job in the entire world, to be president of Harvard. And yet a lot of people have highlighted that her record is very thin. She hasn't published many articles. She's never written a book. It's almost as if she seems to embody this problem of affirmative action or DEI in one person, you could say.
Oh, no, absolutely. I think that her appointment to begin with demonstrates DEI on steroids, if truth be told. In my view, she's not a high-performing academic by any stretch of the imagination, even before the accusations of industrial-scale plagiarism came to the fore. So I think what it really demonstrates is how truly toxic identity politics is, especially in the United States, which it almost gives a lending hand to mediocrity, in my view. And that's doing a fundamental disservice to non-white people living in Western societies such as the United States, who are genuinely talented and have high range of abilities. I think more generally, I've been appalled by these accusations that she's being racially hounded. I think to begin with, her performance in that hearing that we're referring to, where she couldn't clearly state that calling for the genocide of Jewish people wasn't a form of harassment, that is somehow is questionable whether or not it is a form of harassment, is beyond remarkable. But what you want when people are in positions of academic leadership, I think integrity counts for a lot, but also they need to have a very strong scholarly record. And I just look at her record, and I don't think that it's anything but impressive. So I think this sort of DEI cult, in a sense, it threatens to undermine professional academic standards. I think this idea that she's been vilified is nonsense. I think what we're seeing here is people standing up for long-standing conventional professional standards in the academic sector. So all in all, I think it very much shows how toxic the politics of identitarianism is in the United States, especially in the academic sector. And I'll be very interested to see who may replace her in that position. And hopefully it's someone who has a stronger academic record and someone who also takes discrimination more seriously. And when I mean discrimination, that does include anti-Semitism.
I mean, it's interesting that some of the sort of identitarian types, I mean, Mark Lamont Hill comes to mind, have said the next leader must be a black woman, because obviously believing that this row is entirely down to, racial animosity.
No, completely, and completely missing what actually got us to this point, which, as Rakib was saying, was on one hand the seemingly casual response to genuine racial animosity on Harvard's campus and elsewhere. And it should be worth stating that when that congressional hearing took place, the thing that really was so striking about it was the hypocrisy.
Yeah.
Because obviously American universities do have this much stronger tradition of kind of hardcore freedom of speech, academic freedom, in contrast to a place like the UK. Obviously, public universities over there are bound by the First Amendment, which is very free speech absolutist insofar as you can advocate more or less anything as long as it's not direct incitement, harassment, and so on. So, but what was clear was that the very bold line they were taking in relation to anti-Semitic vicious speech was not one that Gay or her colleagues would have taken or were taking in relation to even much more minor forms of so-called offensive speech. I mean, Harvard was actually dead last in the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression's kind of rankings of universities for freedom of speech because of how dreadful it was in relation to censorship, academic freedom, and so on. So that was the thing that really made this seem like, the narrative of Jews don't count them felt very, very powerful in that moment. And also given the fact that what was going on a lot of American university campuses was not some extreme speaker being invited and then being demonstrated against or heckled. There was just, again, kind of low-level examples of harassment, intimidation, all these things happening on a kind of daily basis, which were really making students feel very at threat at that particular university. So to respond to all of that with this kind of boilerplate, legalistic response, which might be the kind of free speech limit, if you like, but it's certainly not one that she would trot out in relation to any other form of contentious speech, spoke volumes about how seriously she and others were taking this particular problem.
Definitely. And wasn't Gay herself a practitioner of cancel culture? There are certain academics, think of like Roland Fryer, who people say that Gay played a role in getting them, if not ousted, but, getting them punished for holding the wrong views.
No, we should lay this out a little bit because that is a fascinating kind of backstory to the whole Claudine Gay phenomenon, which is the fact she has played quite a pivotal role in bringing down a couple of very significant black heterodox academics at Harvard itself. So there was the Roland Fryer example, as you say, who was this real bright star in their kind of economics department. He was a tenured professor at a very young age. He'd won all these awards, but he gained a lot of notoriety because of the fact that a lot of his research into education of African-American kids, or most famously, the likelihood that a police officer would kill a suspect depending on race, came up with results which basically challenged the narrative, shall we say. He got embroiled in a sort of slightly trumped up Me Too scandal, shall we say. People can read the gruesome details for themselves. And she was reportedly very instrumental in, first of all, trying to get him just stripped of his tenure full stop, but also very key in making sure that he was pushed out of the university for the best part of 2 years, that his centre was closed down. And there was another case of, there was a guy called Ronald Sullivan, who people might remember, because he was the Harvard law professor. He also had another particular position at the university he was pushed out of because of the fact he decided to represent Harvey Weinstein, which again was on the basis of not because he was any fan of his, but because everyone, even the most contentious people, deserve representation. She was also reportedly very instrumental in getting him to step down from one particular college position he held. And in fact, when the news of Claudine Gay's ouster broke on the internet, he even tweeted karma and then swiftly deleted it. So I think it's a reflection, particularly when relating to someone like Roland Fryer, who was someone who was seen as such a shining star. He was born into poverty, really kind of pulled himself up by his bootstraps, to use that terrible cliche, and rose to the very top of American academia, who was effectively pulled down, some have argued, because of the fact that he didn't have the right opinions as a black academic. Meanwhile, someone like Claudine Gay, who was born into a kind of family of Haitian cement magnates, as far as I understand it, went to a very nice private school. Because she holds to the certain opinions, shall we say, about things, she's seen as a shining light of diversity. So there's a fascinating sort of subplot to all of this, which is DEI and that whole movement, which Claudine Gay has become a sort of sacrificial lamb for in some respects, was never really about empowering black academics or black students as much as it was presented as. It's very much empowering a certain type of black student and basically just handing the baton from one academic elite to a new one, rather than actually opening things up. So I think that's part of the backstory that's definitely worth looking into, because it's fascinating.
Definitely. And Rakib, finally, I mean, Claudine Gay has gone, but doesn't the cult of, I mean, this is a blow to the cult of DEI, but isn't it so institutionalized now in the US and even here in the UK?
Oh, I think it's a very serious problem. I do sense, though, that the counter challenge to DEI orthodoxy is gathering pace. And I am pleased to see that. I found it very interesting that you did mention Mark Lamont Hill, because he said that Claudine Gay, she must be replaced by another black woman. And then someone on Twitter suggested Candice Owens, and then he wrote back immediately, which is very, very amusing.
I think he said something like, you think they're just interchangeable, which is presumably what he meant.
I think many people have really cottoned on to the toxicity of DEI, that this isn't about diversity. This is actually, much of it's about dissenting opinion being suppressed by those who, in my view, have a deeply censorious appetite. This isn't about promoting diversity of thought, let's be absolutely honest. Is it really about equality of opportunity? In my view, it isn't. It's more about the equalization of outcomes. Those two are very different things. And when you look at much of DEI policy, it's anything but inclusive. In my view, it's deeply exclusionary, especially in the UK, towards, I would say, older sections of the white British mainstream. I think you saw that kind of dynamic with the RAF, if truth be told. So I think a lot of people are beginning to realise, and more people are beginning to realise how truly divisive this is. And that DEI is actually a great deal. It involves a great deal of division. It's not promoting equality in the slightest. In fact, it's about a lot of it's about preferential treatment. And this isn't about promoting a wealth of ideas. Rather, it's trying to create a situation where particular sectors, the people in positions of influence are singing from the same hymn sheet, which I think will actually lower the overall quality and performance of those sectors in the longer term, especially academia.
We all know what it's like. We all want to pick up healthier habits in the new year, but it can be really difficult to know where to start. There's so much conflicting information out there about fad diets and superfoods. None of us really has the time to become an expert in diet or nutrition to get us there. But that's why I've started drinking AG1. AG1 is a comprehensive and convenient daily nutrition supplement. It's got over 70 high-quality ingredients that will help you meet your nutritional needs. I can support my brain, heart, and immune health with just one scoop in the morning. It really is that simple. AG1 contains a broad spectrum of micronutrients and phytonutrients that keep your body nourished all day, every day. Ingredients like vitamin C, zinc, and functional mushrooms help to support your immune health, which is especially vital when it's this cold outside. One pleasant surprise is that AG1 has massively reduced my stress levels. Since I started adding AG1 to my morning routine, I've felt so much more focused and relaxed. That's because AG1 contains powerful plant extracts, adaptogenic herbs, and antioxidants to help promote mental clarity and alertness. It gives me the sustained energy I need throughout the day without the crash I'd normally get from caffeine. The best part about AG1 is that it makes keeping on top of my nutrition effortless. I don't have to take handfuls of vitamins and supplements every morning. All I need is 1 scoop of AG1 mixed with water, and I'm good to go. It means I can stay consistent in giving my body what it needs to thrive. So, if you want to take ownership of your health, try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. Just go to drinkag1.com/spiked. That's drinkag1.com/spiked. Check it out. So the UK's immigration system and asylum system is in a bit of a mess. The UK government, quite dishonestly, has claimed that it's dealt with the backlog of asylum applications, even though there are still about 100,000 people who are waiting to be processed. But also, Rakib, you wrote about 2 interesting cases that I want to draw attention to, suggesting that it's actually quite difficult to get rid of people who really shouldn't deserve asylum or shouldn't deserve protection in the UK. So there was an ISIS propagandist and an Albanian crime lord who we recently learned cannot be removed from Britain. Do you want to tell us a bit about this?
Totally remarkable. And I covered these 2 cases in a recent piece that I authored for us at Spike. So one was a man of Sudanese origin, an ISIS propagandist who had illegally entered the UK. Then he was granted British citizenship. Then fleeing from Sudan, apparently he returned to Sudan, where he peddled a great deal of this propagandist material on behalf of ISIS. And then the Home Office essentially attempted to strip him of his British citizenship. And this particular individual managed to sneak into Britain for a second time, which doesn't really say much about our border security. But what was all the more remarkable was that he was granted right to remain on human rights grounds, which is just utterly remarkable. And then you have people, including academics who specialize in security and intelligence, who have expressed how truly astonished they are by this judicial decision. And in another case, we have an Albanian crime boss, again, using provisions from the European Convention on Human Rights in order to remain in the UK. I think what this also, we know how dysfunctional the asylum system is, the fact that we're not able to provide sanctuary to people who are genuinely at risk of violence and persecution in their homelands. But it also shows, in my view, inadequacies when it comes to how people are being naturalised. The kind of individuals who are being able to acquire UK citizenship to begin with. So I think we have what we need really, and what I call for in our article, is systems level change, whether it's our legal immigration system, our dysfunctional asylum regime, but also tightening up the processes when it comes to citizenship acquisition in the UK.
Tom, I mean, it does just feel like absolutely no one, or at least no law-abiding person, is served well by the current mess. Because, as Rakib said, if you genuinely are seeking asylum, it's actually very difficult to get your case heard. I mean, actually, Rakib, you wrote about this, last year. There's the case of all these, Afghan interpreters or people who worked with the British Army who are soon to be persecuted who are being persecuted in Afghanistan. They can't get in. They have no special rights. British citizens aren't being served because, lots of people who are criminals are allowed in and can't be deported, seemingly. I mean, it just seems like the whole thing is a mess.
It's a complete mess. And it's also a big problem and should be recognised as such by people who do want, as I think we all do, a generous but also sane asylum system. This is becoming a complete block to that. People have no faith in the system whatsoever because it's become clear that it's sufficiently dysfunctional that it's become a route for sort of illegal migration in many respects, but also just a giant loophole which is being exploited by various nefarious characters, whether that be criminals or terrorists. Yeah. And that's not to suggest that your average asylum seeker is either of those two things, to suggest you shouldn't have a system which allows people to pose as asylum seekers in order to do harm or in order to, again, carry on in a way that we shouldn't want in this country or any country. I mean, it's so blindingly obvious to me. And yet there's this very nervousness about talking about the fact that, for instance, there have been a sort of string of terrorist attacks, not just in the UK, but across Europe, where people have either posed as asylum seekers in order to get into Europe. That happened with some of the people involved in the Paris attack. They were dispatched by ISIS across the Mediterranean because they knew that the checks would be insufficient so they could actually sneak their way into Europe. And there's also been a string of cases where, because there isn't this level of security, because there isn't this level of monitoring, there have been cases in the UK, whether it's the Reading attack or the Parsons Green bombing and so on, the botched bombing in Liverpool.
Yeah.
So what was that, about a year or so ago, where these people were basically caught up in the asylum system or here legitimately, but obviously weren't being kept as close enough of an eye on to work out if they might pose some sort of security problem. It seems to me it doesn't matter how generous you want to be in relation to a question like asylum. This should concern you from a public safety perspective, but also from the perspective of maintaining public support for these programs, which there really is when the need is there.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one thing that came up in the whole discussion about the Rwanda policy. When people really polled this, things like the rule about if you enter illegally, you should never be able to claim asylum, didn't sit well with people because they could all think of these examples of someone who might have made that crossing because they had no other option. They might have been someone who worked with us in Afghanistan and so on. So there is that desire to be open for people, but at the same time, you're not going to be able to implement that, and you're not going to be able to overcome the clear concerns that do exist, nevertheless, if the system is this dysfunctional.
Yeah.
And the fact that people on, say, the more pro side of the argument refuse to even engage in some of these discussions, I think is really alarming in that sense.
Definitely. And Rakib, I mean, one of the things that it keeps coming up, I'm not sure that this is entirely to blame, but one of the blockages, it seems, is the ECHR and the broader sort of human rights framework. I mean, it does obviously strike the vast majority of people that it's ridiculous that, say, an Albanian crime boss should, cannot be deported on human rights grounds or and things like that. Or the ISIS member that you mentioned earlier even has to be kept anonymous on human rights grounds. We can't even name this person, so his neighbours don't even know who he is.
I think it's such a, and it's good that you raised those points, because the man of Sudanese origin, who was responsible for peddling pro-ISIS material, he's been granted lifelong anonymity. So people could be living very close to him, his own neighbours. They will have absolutely no clue about his terror-related history. The Albanian crime boss, the National Crime Agency, has said it is very likely that this particular individual is going to return to a life of crime. So these are people that they do pose a genuine threat to social order in the UK. I think in terms of the ECHR and also the 1951 Refugee Convention, people can talk a big game, and the Conservative Party certainly does, but there's a fundamental difference between the rhetoric and the reality. If they feel that we cannot foster and forge a human rights framework which ultimately prioritises the interests of the law-abiding majority, while the UK is a signatory to the European Convention on Human Rights or the Refugee Convention, which I believe that they were sort of finalised in 1950 and 1951 respectively. So there is a strong case for modernising those treaties and conventions. So they really need to campaign either that UK spearheads a process of modernisation, tries to cultivate international support for that, or they have to seriously entertain withdrawing the UK from those treaties and conventions if they genuinely believe that they cannot cultivate and foster a human rights framework for the UK, which ultimately prioritises the safety and security of the law-abiding majority in the country.
And Tom, I mean, it does feel like it's always the sort of non-democratic parts of the state that are in some ways the most dysfunctional or acting in the ways that are most, just so obviously anathema to public opinion and basic common sense.
And the two things have definitely gone in tandem, I think, which is the more that our migration policy has been kind of shaped by judges or lawfare, the more our migration policy has been something which politicians, whether they know it or not, are kind of force-fielding from any proper reform because they just gesture to the ECHR and say nothing can really be done. And the more that the Tories have basically said one thing and done another on this, the more vexed the issue has become, but also the more dysfunctional our policy has become. I mean, anyone can recognise the issues that exist with some of the cases that we've been talking about. And yet, because there is either this fear of going there for fear of looking bad amongst the quote-unquote international community, or because of the fact that there's a lot of politicians, as Rakib was suggesting, who just don't really, they can talk a big game but aren't really willing to dispense with the political capital to engage in the kind of hard-won reform that would be necessary to properly take back control of immigration policy, it just gets worse and worse and worse.
Yeah.
But I think the public are just not going to put up with it anymore. And I think it would do governments of whatever stripe well if they just started listening to what are so obviously just commonsensical problems with this system. But I'm not holding my breath in that regard.
So finally, let's talk a bit about Sir Keir Starmer. He's delivered his New Year's speech this week. Another attempt to set out his vision, which most people have noticed he doesn't seem to have one that we could identify. Tom, I mean, one of the striking things he said was he talked a lot about the sort of cynicism of that people feel towards Westminster. And in particular, he talked about the importance of the vote. Mm-hmm. We've got a general election coming up and people should use their vote wisely for change, voting for him, presumably. That's a little bit rich for Starmer, isn't it, to wax lyrically about the importance of democracy and the vote? Oh,
it is, definitely. I mean, I wrote on Spike this week that Starmer is to democracy and trust in politics what Rolf Harris is to child safeguarding. It's dreadful. This man spearheaded the campaign to overturn the Brexit vote. This man was one of the key kind of architects of that campaign to keep us in the European Union by any means necessary. He talked a lot earlier today when we're recording this in his speech about how people don't want Westminster just kind of arguing with itself all the time. As one of those people who were trying to, stop us from leaving the European Union, he was the one who created that whole environment of never stop talking about a question that the public, as far as they were concerned, was already solved and resolved. So it was incredibly rich. But I really do think Keir Starmer, I mean, he has this sort of halo of being Mr. Sensible. He might not be flashy or interesting or visionary or whatever, but he's a good, honest person. He's genuinely one of the most dishonest politicians of his generation. I mean, he's quietly trying to pretend that he didn't back a second referendum.
Yeah.
Today, he claimed to be in the Q&A like a lifelong supporter of women's spaces because of his background in public service and so on, even though he spent the best part of the last 2 years arguing about how many penises women may or may not have.
One in 1,000.
1 in 1,000, yes. It was what he settled on in the end. But, he campaigned for the Labour leadership, suggesting that Corbyn's agenda was safe in his hands. And as soon as he got it, he started governing like a kind of born-again Blairite. So the capacity for him as a politician to say one thing and do another, to change what it is that he seems to believe based on what constituency he is talking to or what way the wind is blowing, I think is completely blows out the water Boris Johnson or any of these other kind of opportunists that we've had to deal with over recent years. And yet still he's seen as this sort of steady Eddie. He might not be great, but at least he's a good guy. I really don't see it, given his track record in recent years.
Definitely. And Rakib, I mean, there's a sort of danger in, electing someone this empty. I assume we are going to elect him. He is the presumed next prime minister. So we don't know where things are going to go. We don't know what ideas are going to sort of fill the void.
Well, the biggest idea that seems to be coming out of the Labour Party at the moment, if it was to return to power, is a new Race Equality Act, which speaks volumes in terms of the party still very much being enthralled to racial identity politics. I think there have been significant improvements which have been made, especially when it comes to tackling anti-Semitism from the Corbyn era. But I think the main issue is that many people are... It's very difficult to understand what Sir Keir Starmer stands for. And it's for the reasons that Tom has raised. There's a great deal of flip-flopping. He was the chief architect of the second referendum policy ahead of the 2019 general election. Then in the Labour leadership contest, I believe he actually campaigned for the retention of the freedom of movement. And then once he becomes leader, because he thinks there's political gain to be had by saying it, he says that the UK needs to wean itself off immigration dependency. So you don't know truly what he stands for. And I think more generally, I think people overall, they like to support politicians who they feel they have guiding principles. Like these are the key principles that will guide how they will govern the country. And I don't think Sir Keir Starmer falls into that at all. In his speech today, he talked a great deal about anti-establishment sentiment, cynicism towards politicians, how people are right to feel that way. But the truth is, he's contributed towards that. In my view, I think that at times he's been anything but honest. And I think in terms of political integrity, I think he could make serious improvements himself. The speech itself, I didn't find it to be particularly inspiring. I know there was a great deal of talk about how proud he is of the UK and what he wants to do for the country at large. But I think I think he has to do a great deal of convincing. But in some ways, he might not have to, because the Conservatives are in such dire straits that may well be the primary reason why he will end up being Prime Minister. So it's not so much that it's a really positive vote for the Labour Party. It might just be more down to the fact that the people think that the Tories have had enough time in power and that they need to be removed.
And I suppose that's many of the problems we've just discussed about Keir Starmer, you could equally apply to Rishi Sunak, certainly the sort of emptiness of the vision.
No, definitely. I think maybe it's just because I find Keir Starmer particularly irritating, just the way he speaks. I mean, it's like we've been subjected to so many of these vision speeches now, but I genuinely struggle to focus on what it is that he's saying, such as that kind of strange intonation, those sort of numbing nasal tones, the negative charisma. Genuinely, you have to watch things over and over again to try and work out what he's actually just said. Nevertheless, one thing that I think is particular about him, maybe, is the fact that we've been used to these kind of empty suit focus group politicians for a long time. But have we ever really seen one as hollow as this?
Yeah.
Like, really, if you don't like these principles, I've got some more. His whole political project seems to be bound up in the idea that he'd quite like to be Prime Minister. Like, he's like a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy of a Blairite mid-ranking hack. Like, he's so unimpressive. And yet, this man's going to be our next Prime Minister. And you're completely right. We have kind of gone back to the kind of factory reset of British politics, of this sort of technocratic managerialism. None of the big questions are up for debate. It's just about who is going to be the best sort of project manager of the country within very narrow ideological bounds. But Starmer just feels like the pinnacle of all that in the worst possible way. So I'm not looking forward to 4 years of his reign.
Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.